Welcome, everyone. My name is John Paul Jones. I'm the Dean of the College of Social Behavioral Sciences, and it's great to see all of you here tonight at the Fox. Tonight's our third lecture in the Downtown Lecture Series, and we have a treat for you, which is appropriate for the season. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to say a word of thanks first to our community sponsors here behind us. They've made generous donations so that we can be here tonight free. In addition to these sponsors, we have a group of people who are supporting sponsors. They include Kaler Construction Company, Desert Diamond Casinos and Entertainment, Downtown Tucson Partnership, Downtown Kitchen and Cocktails, also known as Llanos, the University of Arizona Institute of the Environment, and Arizona Public Media. We, at another level, have lecture series sponsors, and I'd like to personally thank Lisa Lavallo and Stephanie Healy of Cox Communication, Dion Bretthart of the Southwestern Foundation for Education and Historic Preservation, whose funding is enabling us to reach out to Pueblo High School students who are here tonight. And these talks are integrated into a social studies class that they're taking at the high school. And not least, Kim Bourne of the Zuckerman Family Foundation. Thank you all for that funding. And tonight's food sponsor is Penka, which is really very close by over here. Great, unusual, not Sonoran, but great, unusual Mexican food, and one place in town where you can legally drink bacanora. So I recommend that you try that out. Our title sponsors include the Arizona Daily Star, and last week, as you know, the editor Bobby Joe Buell came up to the stage, and we do that with our title sponsors. Another title sponsor is Tucson Medical Center, and I want to thank personally Mary Atkinson and Julia Strange. And then one of our third title sponsors is the University of Arizona Office of Student Affairs and Enrollment Management, and I'd like to thank Vice President Dr. Melissa Vito for her support. The college has a giving circle. It's called the Magellan Circle. It's appropriate that we circumnavigate, and one of the representatives of the Magellan Circle is with us here tonight, Rowena Gary Medina, and I'd like to have her come up and say a few words about why you're a participant, a member of the Magellan Circle. Rowena? First, I have to embarrass her a little bit. So, Rowena is a U of A graduate, speech communication, with a minor in history. Born in Calexico and lived a double life back and forth across the border. She and her husband, Roy Medina, established Polydrive Industries, one of the few remaining manufacturing outfits here in the state of Arizona. They're located in Phoenix, and in addition to all the other duties that she performs for the company, she's the Chief Financial Officer. Rowena is a Magellan Circle patron. That means that she supports a student every year. She's also a member of our advisory board, and she's the chair of our newly established Innovation Excellence Committee. And we're really delighted that you've taken on that role for the board. Rowena and Roy have also established a professorship in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies in the name of her great-grandmother, Mamie Bernard Aguirre, who was born in 1844 in St. Louis and married a Mexican trader and moved to these parts. I guess they were called Arizona, but we weren't officially a state at that time. And after her husband's untimely death, and with 3 boys to raise, Mamie decided to open a school, and it was the first girls' school in Tucson. And if you go through the diary of Mamie, you will find that she said about these students that it was easily the most unruly set of girls that the Lord had ever let live.
True.
True. So those of you who think that kids these days, interestingly, then after about 20 years, Mamie joined the faculty of the U of A, and she became the department head of both English history and Spanish at the University of Arizona at a time in which 1895, the U of A had 15 faculty and 155 students, which for the faculty in the room, I'll let you know that's a great student-to-faculty ratio. Thank you, Rowene, for saying a few words on behalf of the Circle.
Thank you, JP. Let's see if I'm not, whoops.
Came to you.
Okay. Is that going to be too close?
That'll be fine.
Okay. I'm not quite as tall as JP, as you can tell. And he did all that without notes. And here I am with my notes in front of me. But I wanted to make sure that I get, thank you.
How many engineers does it take to put a light bulb in? There you go. Is that better?
I think that's better. So I get so excited about the Magellan Circle and what's involved with it and what it's meant to Roy and me that I wanted to make sure that I got all the points across to you. So here I am with my notes, being shamed by JP, who had all of that to say about me and my family, all off the cuff. I think he deserves a hand. So good evening. I'm Rowena Gary Medina, and my husband, Roy, and I are members of the Magellan Circle, and as JP told you, it's the circle that, it's the donors circle for the College of Social and Behavioral Science. What we do in the Magellan Circle is we support research, we support students, and we also support community impact, community involvement, community outreach, like where we are tonight. As Magellan Circle members, we have had the opportunity to meet with and get to know our professors and to get to know their research. We've had the wonderful opportunity as Magellan Circle members to sponsor students and to meet these amazing students and to watch how they progress and how they're doing research that's being guided by our professors. And we've had the opportunity to be involved in events like this. I want you to know, if you're a Magellan Circle member, you get to sit up in the front. And you don't even have to stand in line at all. So there are real advantages. Another thing, we have had the wonderful opportunity, and we have some of our traveling companions with us here tonight, to travel with U of A professors. We've traveled to Turkey, we've traveled to Israel and Palestine. Membership in the Magellan Circle has enriched Roy's and my life. And we believe that when we support research and students and community outreach, that we can change the world in real and measurable ways. Roy and I believe that our investment in the Magellan Circle makes a difference. It makes a difference in what's happening in this world. We feel that with the Magellan Circle involvement, we can touch the future. So what I'd like to do is extend an invitation to each and every one of you to join us in the Magellan Circle. As you're leaving today in the lobby, there's information about Magellan Circle. So we'd like you to go through that and look at it, and we'd like you to join us. You can be right up here in the front row and not have to stand in line. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowene. So now it's my great pleasure. I think I will have to pull this up just a bit here. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Maribel Alvarez. Maribel is the she's an associate research social scientist in the Southwest Center in the College of SBS, and she's also an associate research professor in the School of Anthropology. And she was recently named an Agnes Nelms Howry Fellow in the College of SBS. You may have read about Agnes's very generous gift to the university. She received her bachelor's and master's degree from Cal State Long Beach and her PhD degree from our top-ranked School of Anthropology. Maribel is a folklorist. A folklorist means a lot of things probably to different people, but the area that Maribel specializes in is to read cultural meanings in material culture in everyday life. And she does that through food and decorative arts and crafts and poetry, using interpretive techniques and semiotics on both the objects and also through oral histories and storytelling. She's published 6 books in traditional cultures and folk life, in the practices of ethnography, how to do ethnography, and also on borderland foods. And although she is not from the southern Arizona Sonora region, she is a specialist and crosses the border a great deal, partly through her work as the co-director of Sabores Sin Fronteras, or Flavors Without Borders, which is a group that works with ranchers and farmers in a binational context. Maribel is a trustee of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. She's also a winner of a Fulbright Fellowship, and she's received grant funding from the Ford Foundation and from the National Endowment of the Arts, and also from the Arizona Humanities Council. She is well known to many of the people in the community for her leadership over the past 4 years of Tucson Meet Yourself. The 41-year-old cultural event occurs every October that was established at the U of A through the work of Big Jim Griffith. She has, I think, really helped energize that organization, but perhaps more importantly, this year, Maribel led an effort to create an umbrella organization for TMY called the Southwest Folklife Alliance. And this is an organization is a 501c3 and has a strong partnership with the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, bringing for a broader regional perspective and also for a more diverse substantive domains, an opportunity for the and the place that they live in, especially from the cultural aspects. And I'll just say that I personally am delighted to have the opportunity to work with Maribel and to see the Southwest Folklife Alliance develop over the next several years. Please join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Dr. Maribel Alvarez.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to dedicate this tonight's talk to my students at the University of Arizona, specifically in a class called The Anthropology of Food, who have served as guinea pigs for many of the ideas that I'm about to share with you tonight. I know we're here to talk about food. Let me start with an image that you may recognize or maybe not. Last year, the Smithsonian Magazine published a series called 100 Objects That Made America. They were mostly objects taken from items in the collection of the museums at the Smithsonian, and among them, this. Literally, a piece of the lunch counter from Greensboro, North Carolina. I know, huh? Where 4 African-American students in 1960 sat at a Woolworth store, refused to get up, and launched in that way what really would become the sitting face of the civil rights movement. Like many moments, seminal moments of the civil rights movement, this was a deliberate action. It was planned to be this way, and it is not very surprising that food would have been at the center of such a symbolic moment in the history of our country that actually redefined in so many ways the assumptions of our social contract. There's lots of things to say about food. I think everybody knows that, and lots of people are saying it. But the one thing that everybody can agree upon about food is that food, as we know, is fundamental to our existence, to our reproduction as a species. Every living organism eats. For us humans, though, there's a bit of a more peculiar quandary with food because we're the only ones that cook. Food is also really habitual. It's what we do every day. It is, in that sense, a big deal and no deal at all. One of the reasons that food is complicated is because it's always simultaneously biological and social. Can't separate the two. It's something extremely material that is also extremely symbolic. And very few areas of our lives can match the magnitude that food takes when it moves across all these different dimensions of our lives. Take, for example, something like food addictions. This is the one thing of all the addictions where you cannot go cold turkey on. The drug that afflicts you is the same drug that you need to nourish your ability to fight the affliction. That's complicated. In fact, food is so much a part of our lives that it has penetrated our everyday speech in the form of metaphors. So we say things like, she hungers for success. Don't sugarcoat the truth. Can't have your cake and eat it too. It's time to spice things up. He sank his teeth into the job until it was done. And of course, my favorite of all, which is, come here, sweetie pie. No wonder that a man who knew a thing or two about food had this to say. If you really want to make a friend, go to someone's house to eat with him or her. The people who give you their food give you their heart. Who was that? Yes, none other than Cesar Chavez. Hey, I'm an anthropologist, I'm a folklorist. That basically means that I'm interested in the meaning of everything. And nowadays, boy, do I have material for my research. There is a food vogue going in America. We have celebrity chefs, we have food channels, food magazines, bestsellers on food, food gurus, food stores, food clubs, food everywhere. Well, this is something that today I'm not going to talk about. Today what I want to talk about, though, is on something that you all kind of know in a way, but that is also fraught with incredible assumptions that I hope to undermine this evening. Folklorist Roger Abrams described us, Americans, as equal opportunity eaters. And we know about ethnic foods, but what I'm going to do today is explore a little bit the role that ethnic culinary traditions have played in forming the American foodscape. And vice versa. I want to talk about how the American socioeconomic scape is affecting how immigrants and the poor and those most vulnerable in our society are in the same way affected in their food traditions. That have been especially informative for my learning about food, the private and the public. In the private, I'm going to talk about a family of immigrants that I know very well, my own family. And on the public side, I'm going to talk about what JP mentioned, a festival that I have the honor of directing here in Tucson. Tucson Meet Yourself, which I know, everybody calls it Tucson Eat Yourself. I'm going to share this story in 5 episodes, and all of you received a card when you came in with 5 sayings, and there are 5 variants on the phrases we eat and we are. I'm going to be moving back and forth between the private and the public, between Tucson Meet Yourself and my family stories, and I'm doing this on purpose, because one of the goals that I have tonight is to blur a little bit that line that separates our domestic alimentary domains from the responsibility that we have as public eaters. My hope is that when you walk out of here tonight, I would have challenged maybe 1 or 2 assumptions that you had about ethnic foods and food in the story of your own life. Let's look at the first one of these, the most common. We are what we eat. If you Google this phrase, 440,000 instances come up in less than 30 seconds. It's so common that it has become part of our proverbial folk speech. In fact, the phrase was coined by a French epicure and gastronome. I think that's how you say in French, food critic. In 1825, Anselme Brillat-Savarin coined the phrase, we are what we eat. And he published a book called The Physiology of Taste. And although the thesis of his book was that any kind of food could be amazing and excellent if you do it with enough artistry, the phrase went on to take a life of its own that was not exactly that meaning. In fact, the phrase, for the most part, is a phrase of judgment. Coded in the phrase are the assumptions that mental schemes of social classification divide people according to what they eat. In other words, if you are a refined person, you eat refined foods. And finally, if you are eating junk food, the suspicion is you may be junk after all. That's not very nice. In fact, probably there are people here in our audience tonight, here in Tucson, Mexican-American community members, who remember a time not that long ago when burritos as lunch to schools in America, many people were forced to give their culinary traditions and opted instead to fill their lunch boxes with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which was, of course, the more dominantly and well-accepted food tradition. Now, food is one of those things that it can really reinforce who you are in a lot of ways, stay with the familiar and the comfortable, or be used to affirm a cultural value. For example, myself, I love grilled salmon, not exactly a culinary tradition from my Cuban heritage. However, when I'm away, traveling, working very hard, and I come home to Tucson, the one thing that always awaits me as my welcoming dinner or meal is a pot of black beans. My parents, Hilda and Enrique, negotiated their relationship to food very much along the same lines that many immigrants have done before. That is, along a spectrum that went from pleasure and desire to apprehension and fear. In other words, from the familiar to the strange. Let me tell you a little bit about their story. My parents met in Cuba. They were from the same hometown, but they married in New York in 1954. My father came first to get a job. They were working blue-collar people. He got a job at a factory in New York until he can get enough money to then send for my mother, who came, and then they got married. In New York, when they were there, they settled in Queens. And by the time that my sister Sonia, seen here in this picture, was 3 years old, they had already established themselves as a working class, but pretty comfortable and pleasant life in New York, living in an apartment. They had a big TV, which is featured prominently in the photograph. Look at how beautiful my mother looks, right? And all the stylish clothing and the Formica table in the dining set. It's very small. And of course, they enjoy themselves, especially because at that time, the major dominant figure in TV was another Cuban, which filled the airways every night in the I Love Lucy show, Ricky Ricardo, of course. So life was good in that sense. Cuba at the time was in the upheaval of revolution. My uncle, pictured there in the center, had been part of the revolutionary struggle, and so was my grandmother. In my grandmother's house in Cuba, there is an official plaque recognized by the government as one of the homes that aided in the revolutionary movement. My father was not interested at that time in remaining in Cuba. He was doing well in New York. However, as expatriate in New York, he and other Cubans were raising money, were doing fundraisers and aiding the revolutionary cause. And on 1959, they celebrated the triumph of Cuba Libre, of the arrival of Castro and the barbudos, the bearded ones in Havana. And although he lived to regret it many years later, the one lifting the fist is my father. Stories of food scarcity had actually played a big role in how my family had turned to become revolutionaries. My grandmother had been a socialist since the 1930s, and part of that was because she had experienced a lot of food inequality and abuses of powers and discrimination in Cuban society perpetrated by the government and by the established elites. My father's childhood was populated with incredible moments of sadness about lack of food or people discriminating against him because they were poor. These imprinted in him a sense of rage and at the same time a hunger that was insatiable. And funny enough, the two often went together. He developed an idea of what being a man was all about. And most of that had to do with being a good provider. In fact, he lived to this credo that a man should provide for their family food above everything else to some ridiculous extremes. My mother and my brother and sister and I sometimes begged to differ from him a little bit. We thought that the definition of a good husband and father should have expanded a little bit beyond food, but we could never win that argument with him. The sad thing was that we couldn't because he was an excellent provider. My parents learned to become world eaters in New York. And this marked them a little bit different from the other Cubans who usually stayed a little bit closer to their home traditions. But my parents were very curious about trying other cultural experiences in general. They learned how to eat food, Italian food, from an Italian lady that used to live in the same apartment complex in Queens. They actually enjoy eating things like pastrami at some of the delicatessens from the Eastern European immigrants in New York. I grew up listening to all of these stories. As a resident alien in the United States with a green card in the 1950s, my father was drafted into the army for the Korean War. Oh boy, did this open up a world of culinary adventures for him. But I'm not talking about traveling around the world. I'm talking about his excitement of being recruited to work in the mess hall. My father used to tell stories about how Los Americanos had incredible piles of potatoes that he gladly volunteered to peel because there were so many potatoes. He would just get so excited by the sheer abundance as if he was a kid in a candy store. My father always thought of the United States ever since as a place of culinary diversity, culinary abundance, and in general, culinary strength. All of this really, of course, was not that unusual for an immigrant. Most immigrants come to this country with food in their minds because they have experienced food security that sometimes is very severe in their home countries. In fact, we know from testimony that many of the Ellis Island immigrants that came to the United States tell stories about their first meal that they ate here was in some ways an act of redemption for them. And when I talk about immigrants coming, oh boy, did they come. Between 1820 and 1920, there were 34 million Eastern Europeans, mostly Europeans, who came to the United States, some from Asia. This gave the United States an influx of new culinary points of view like you wouldn't believe it. Of course, these new culinary points of view were already added or layered upon other traditions of foodways that were already rooted in the American soil, namely the Native American traditions and, of course, the experience of the African slaves. All of that brought together what really became the simmering pot of American diversity that we have come to know, and that is largely represented in this audience tonight. For years and years, I have speculated about my father's fascination with food. I have thought maybe it had to do with some sort of longing inside his heart that he couldn't ever articulate. Maybe it had to do with this or that, but after a while I decided that it doesn't really benefit me that much to psychologize his memory in this way. What I do know, and I did take away from my father, was the fact that what your experience is early on in life about food access Of course, this is very familiar to us. So many of us associate food and love and comfort together and passion. This is why when we think that we're falling in love with somebody, the first thing we want to do is go out on a date and have a good dinner together. Many people make fun of the United States because it doesn't really have a cuisine. It has the cuisine of everybody else. What is American food? Well, it's Chinese food and it's pizza. And they make fun of us. But one of our finest food historians, Professor Donna Gavascia, has actually said that this may actually be a strength of the United States. And I happen to agree with her. Not only is food mixing and hybridity a recurrent theme in our history as a nation, but it actually encodes in a perfect way the best ideals of our notion of pluralism and democracy. Ask any immigrant, and they will tell you that food diversity in the United States remains, even today, one of the last few signs that they see that we may still succeed as this experiment of democracy, that is this country. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons that so many immigrants, the first thing they do is open up a business to share their food. That's also the reason why so many immigrants are involved in the hospitality and food industry in this country. Many of them out of necessity for wages and jobs that other people wouldn't take. But not only that, a lot of them with an incredible passion and dedication to actually serving and cooking food for other people. Now, I'm not going to be naive. I know that there are cycles, and in American history we have had periods of incredible tolerance for ethnic diversity in food and culinary ways, and other times of hostility. The American monoculture in food tends to have a cycle that goes something like this. First, a period of shaming, then appropriation of that food, then some sort of transformation. Think, for example, of tofu burritos. And then reintegration, where you actually then sell that food that you modify to the same group that originated it. So sometimes we know that that story can go in many different directions, though. Our history books are filled with notions about social reformers who try to teach the poor and teach the immigrant how to eat and what to eat and how to eat American. Well, we also know that there have been, even close to home, in the Tohono O'odham community, for example, the history of what happened to this amazing community when first the reservation system, and first the land grabs, and then the limited access to water. And before you know it, we are completely depleting them from their actual natural resources. Instead, we are providing commodity surplus foods in the form of sugar and flour and cheese. And then we turn around and get surprised that there is major health nutrition problems among the community in spite of this history that we ourselves have produced. As a matter of fact, in the United States, food education has always been related one way or another to food fears, panic of eating or tasting something that may actually completely alter the landscape of our health and sanitary laws. The 1880s was a time when classes for cooking and nutrition for immigrants was really popular. Churches, libraries, schools, everywhere. Speaking of immigrants, I told you that I was going to talk about to submit yourself. One of the things that surprises people the most about Tucson Meet Yourself is the sheer diversity of food that are represented in the event. People know that in Chicago, LA, and New York, they have come to expect this. But at Tucson Meet Yourself this year alone, we had 40 different kinds of foods represented. And people always say, you have that much variety in Tucson, Arizona? And the varieties sometimes are not only ethnic, but also encompass regional and folk traditions. We have had many different programs that explore heritage foods concerning not only ethnicity. And the funny thing about it is that Tucson Meet Yourself is not even primarily a food festival. It really is a festival that has hundreds of artists, folk artists, hundreds of music and dance performance, hundreds of community groups that share information. However, our founder, Dr. Folks and his wife Loma in 1974, he said, food will be the fat, sugar-coated carrot that will attract people to what is essentially an educational event. The core idea of To Meet Yourself is divested of any of that judgment that we saw in Briyad Savarin's phrase. As a matter of fact, this is why people love the festival, because they can express their culinary traditions in the terms that they wish to express it. Nobody's telling them, you should really eat this, or this is not good for your community. They actually come and offer that as a gift to the community in their own terms. In 1974, this is the question that Jim wanted to answer. What is the best way to dramatize Tucson's plural society for the greatest possible number of Tucsonans? And yes, I know he chose food because it was very attractive, but there was another reason. He really believed that some of the best artists were hiding in kitchens in the different barrios in Tucson. He said, there was beauty everywhere, and there was no way of sharing that. In 1974, the ideas of Tucson Meet Yourself were really bold and dramatic. Diversity and multiculturalism were not terms that were that popular yet. They would later become so in the 1980s and 90s. But at the time, right under the city's leader's nose, there was all this diversity staged and occupying the center of town, the civic space where for 41 years the event has taken place. Not very far from that civic space, city planners and organizers were doing all kinds of other damaging things to diversity in Tucson. And that has been a story told magnificently in a book by a University of Arizona professor, Lidia Otero, called La Calle. The nature of a festival is to invert the social order. In fact, while Tucson Meet Yourself tells everybody that it's a celebration of food for everyone and it is to create unity, what it really does is that for 72 hours, it takes all those food traditions that are marginalized and makes them dominant. And that's what festivals do. They bracket time. They allow you to step out of your ordinary life into an extraordinary experience that will create that kind of symbolic inversion and made it possible. Now, I know it is entirely possible to eat the food of a culture and also despise that culture at the same time. This is why one of the ways that I want to explore today is we are what we don't eat, or the story of stereotypes. Sure, food can be a great equalizer, but it also is a barrier that requires some crossing. Journalist Gustavo Arellano has written a pretty fabulous book called Taco USA, How Mexican Food Conquered America. And the introduction to that book, he tells a stomach-churning story about being invited to debate in Colorado former Republican Congressman Tom Tancredo. Before they go on the debate, Tom Tancredo and him meet at a Mexican restaurant. Tancredo orders a plate of tamales with rice and beans and just dives into it with wanton abandon. An hour later, he's on stage debating Arellano, and telling everybody that Mexicans represent cultural suicide for the United States culture. The most recent great migration we've had, of course, is from Mexicans all over the United States. And Arellano says that this is a reconquista of sort. It's been a conquest by 1,000 tacos. In fact, he defines Mexican food as being a perpetual foreigner perfectly at home in the United States. Another person from Colorado, folklorist Mario Montaño, has written about the use of offal meats in some Mexican dishes, and has made the point that every time that two cultures have met, between a dominant culture and a culture that is dominated, the dominant culture has always made it a point to find the subjugated culture somehow gastronomically defective. We have an example of this very close to home in the case of wheat and corn. For many years, the Spaniards insisted, and many people in Mexico started to believe, that corn was that kind of grain associated with indigenous people, whereas wheat was the Spanish grain that, of course, made people taller and smarter and more industrialist. Our own Jesus Garcia here from the Desert Museum has done a beautiful story indicating how in his family in Sonora, when they moved from corn tortillas to wheat tortillas, it represented symbolically their upward mobility as a family. Montaño gives the story and the example of menudo. How many of you have ever tried menudo? Good, we have a friendly eating audience here. Menudo is a classic example of the cycle that I showed you of rejection, appropriation, and then integration. Because menudo really is produced and is cooked from using tripe, which is the stomach of the cow. It's chewy. You have to boil it. It actually smells kind of interesting while you're boiling it. And people use a lot of seasonings to put on menudo. And for the long time, menudo was something that only Mexican Americans ate in their own communities. But before you know it, now there are entire menudo cook-offs in the Southwest. And most of the menudo champions are not even Mexican Americans or Mexicans. This has really transformed the way that people relate to the food, and college students have started to discover that menudo is the favorite food to eat after a heavy night of partying, leading to some internet sales of t-shirts like this: Menudo, the breakfast of champions. By the way, festivals are an excellent site to practice food transgressions. You can do this at a festival without risking too much social capital. To submit yourself, you would think that the way that we approach food actually makes ethnicity simplified, because you have to simplify something in order to present it to a large public, and we do get about 100,000 people. But think also about the ways in which to submit yourself complicates identities. For example, in society at large, outside of festival time, people talk about white people. Well, in to submit yourself, that's a completely useless term. Because for us, it's Swedish and Danish and Scottish and Greek. Everybody has a tradition that they're honoring, that they come from. And the same thing happens for the term Asian. Completely meaningless at to submit yourself. You mean Laotians or Chinese, or you mean Hawaiians, or you mean Indian? The fact that we spend some time in these specificities is important, because being specific about where people come from actually humanizes those who are cooking the food. And sometimes food traditions can be treated in some pretty dramatic ways. We don't consider food traditions relics that you put somewhere on a shelf and keep them there to watch and observe them at a distance. As a matter of fact, the latest installment of To Submit Yourself has brought us the Dragon Dog, a creation of Jason Wong here in Tucson, that he refuses to share the secret recipe and ingredients. The Chinese Cultural Center sells this at their own events at the center and at To Submit Yourself only. For us, authenticity in the festival really means context, providing as much context as possible. That's why this year, for the first time, we created these infographics that were posted on top of some of the food booths so that when people were waiting in line to get their food, they could actually learn some facts and interesting stories about the groups that were cooking and selling the food. At the end of the day, Tucson Meet Yourself is a working folks festival. When you go there, that's the kind of food you're going to get. That's the kind of environment you're going to feel. Sometimes in the history of the festival, that has played out beautifully, and some people don't really like that. We continue to do it, though, and have a lot of fun. You may have noticed when you came that the title of my talk was actually an inversion on that most popular phrase. It's actually, we eat what we are. This brings the idea of food to a different realm, away from the stereotypes, brings it to the arena of solidarity. And it speaks about belonging and family and identity. And I have to tell you, although there are some groups that have used food attachment to populations in not so many flattering ways as I just described, on the other hand, there are populations that have claimed foods as their own with a great deal of pride. I was a witness here in Tucson to an exchange between two refugee ladies who have an amazing program for food development here about which baklava was better. An Iraqi baklava or an Egyptian baklava? Food is the most enduring of all the social identity markers. Did you know that? You can be 8 generations removed Greek, and there'll still be some Greek tradition that pops up somewhere in the back of your mind in some recipe at some Thanksgiving dinner. Food promiscuity is one of the things that makes it so popular. For example, Germans came to the United States, mostly to the coastal cities. Eventually, very quickly, they moved to the Midwest, became many of them farmers, had never seen corn before. And before you know it, within a generation, cornbread was something that you found at almost every German gathering. Professor Gabasha, who I just mentioned, gives us the example of the bagel as the quintessential American story. In 1890, the only people who ate bagels in the United States were Eastern European Jews. It was a bread that Americans were not very familiar with at all. It was kind of hard and kind of chewy. And of course, who started to eat the food, the bagels? The neighbors of the Jewish immigrants. Jewish immigrants so bad at all and wanted to eat it. So much so that Lender's Bagels established a factory to manufacture bagels commercially. The manufactured version of the bagel, though, was softer and sweeter than the authentic bagel. In Israel, they don't think of bagels as a Jewish food. They think of bagels as an American food. Now, we don't know when was it that bagel met cream cheese in their perfect partnership. But what we do know is that cream cheese began 100 years before bagels got popular by Quaker immigrants in the Delaware Valley of Philadelphia. The story of food as a glue to our affections actually goes back quite a bit. About 500,000 years ago, when fire was first managed by human populations or our ancestors. As a matter of fact, Cambridge archaeologist Martin Jones says that it really was a game changer, this fire thing. Up to that moment, if you actually sat across from somebody, looked them in the eye, opened your mouth and showed your teeth, that was an act of hostility. Fire changed that, not only because it was a new taste-enhancing technology for our ancestors, but because it did two things. It transformed what was only shelter up to that moment into a hearth. And out of the hearth came the idea that we cherish today as conviviality. Family dinner is the hearth, and is perhaps the most cherished American secular ritual. At the family table, of course, I don't have to tell you, is where we have the most intense conversations, right? And also, it's been shown by sociologists and experts that children get an incredible benefit from sitting at the table for dinner. They not only expand their vocabulary tremendously when they experience dinner on a regular basis, they also learn manual dexterity faster. Yes. But let me not romanticize dinner so much. I know that, for example, the sex and gender regime is perfectly coded at the dinner table as well. As a matter of fact, dinner is a preferred seat for patriarchy. For many people, cooking is not a joy. It's actually a burden. This is one reason why anthropologist Mary Douglas said, we have to look at food as a system of communication, as something that is intrinsically symbolic. And her famous phrase, which my students love, is, food is not feed. Humans don't just randomly eat anything. We actually eat according to a whole scale of values that we process symbolically to each one of our meals and choices. Mary Douglas has also talked about the fact that each family has a family food system, just like they have a hygiene system, or they have a system for rest. Where are you going to sleep? Who sleeps with whom? Where are the bathrooms and bedrooms located to each other? The family food system that I grew up with really, in a lot of ways, did not make our family. That's me on the right. It did not represent the best or the worst ways in our homes are not represented symbolically the best or the worst or the most important, but they represent the maintenance work of keeping that family together. Of course, for Cubans, ropa vieja, meat, deliciously cooked, is at the center of everything, and it's the basis of that continuity that we actually attach to the staples that we eat. Let me show you what the basic architecture of a Cuban meal looks like. You can have soup and dessert and salad, viands like plátanos and other yuca. You can have rice, beans, vegetables, but at the center is always some meat dish, and of course you finish it off with cafecito. Let me tell you something, for example, about rice, just very quickly. Rice is an interesting food in the Cuban palate because the rice was introduced in the Caribbean by Spanish. They took very well to the wet coastlands of the Caribbean, just like it did in the shores of South and North Carolina here in the United States. But rice had been domesticated for 3,000 years before the Spanish arrived here by the Africans in Africa, right? So it fell to many of the African slaves in the New World to be the ones who actually tended and took care of the rice plantations and of the rice crops. Therefore, rice represents in the Cuban palate a perfect hybrid food of our heritage. I don't know if you saw the paper today, but the Arizona Daily Star included today a recipe of my mother's arroz con pollo. And if you didn't read the recipe carefully, you may want to check it out, because the secret of my mother's arroz con pollo is that you don't cook it with water, you cook it with beer. Cubans eat rice in all kinds of varieties. You can have arroz con puerco, arroz con calamares. I've had arroz con garbanzos. We can have all kinds of things thrown with rice because rice has two incredible advantages. Fills you up really quickly, and it can be mixed with a whole bunch of things. One of the Cuban dishes that is favored by many people is called arroz con salchichas. And when I say salchichas, I don't mean like fancy sausages, I mean Vienna sausages. In my family, I learned two things out of our family food system. One had to do with gender and gender roles. And that was pretty predictable and firm and conservative. And the other had to do with feasting. The idea that, in a lot of ways, allowed the license to undermine the first idea. What do I mean by that? Well, my mom and dad and my family was working class folks, and my dad was a plumber, my mom was a homemaker, until my mom had to start to go to work, and it fell on my grandfather, who lived to age 98, by the way, to actually take the responsibility for cooking a meal for us every night. We always love Easter, not because we were particularly religious, and not because we were out of school and watching Jesus movies all weekend, but because on Good Friday, that's when my dad would cook. And he would always make, on Good Friday, his famous pescado en escabeche. And pescado en escabeche is one of those foods that you didn't eat the rest of the year. In a lot of ways, it was a certain prestigious kind of food. It had swordfish, steaks of swordfish, and it actually has really fancy ingredients like peppercorns, capers, and you marinate all of that in vinegar with onions and bell peppers. But these celebratory aspects of food have started to morph in our society into less pleasant conversations. That's why the next section that I want to explore is called We Eat What We Can, Food Security. Gary Nabhan, my colleague, and Professor Diana Lieberman, the two previous speakers, have both talked about food security. Basic definition is simple. It's when you run out of food before you get your next paycheck, or when you run out of money in order to buy more food. The USDA started counting or tracing food insecurity in 1995, and the worst year since they started counting was 2007, 2008. Which tells us right away that food insecurity and hunger have a lot to do with employment and housing. Not a very radical publication, but Newsweek actually had this headline in 2010, talking about the great food divide in America. And some people say, but come on, we've always had rich and poor. Yes, that is true. But now we're living in a society of extremes. Let me show you, for example, this number. The top income has risen in the last 20 years by 20%. But the lowest levels of the income for all Americans has remained flat. And if you account for inflation on that, you know that that means it has actually dropped. Take this statistic. The average foodie spends about 20% of their income on food. The average American family spends about 13% on food. Now, if you think that that 7-point difference is not that significant, think about this. An average salary in Tucson for a family or for an entry-level job or even professional jobs at the University of Arizona of $800. To put it in perspective, this is one reason why Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen just last week sounded the alarm on the incredible dilemma of income inequality in America. And the reason that she did, and she was highly criticized for doing this, Federal Reserve Chairman shouldn't be speaking about poverty, is because she actually perceived this as a major threat to the stability of American capitalism. This is the statistic that she publicized in her press speech. Since 1989, the bottom 50% of Americans, their net worth is $11,000. But that net worth is 50% lower than it was in 1989. Contrast that with the top 5% in our society. The net worth of the top 5% on average is $6.8 million. But that's not the most shocking of their statistics. That net worth of the top 5% has actually grown since 1989, 89%. So I tell you, while I think it's fascinating that we have a vogue now of eating organic and local and all these wonderful, fabulous initiatives that we have here in Tucson that will allow us to be called the city of gastronomy, and perhaps we are on the forefront of many of those solutions to those problems. While that is true, I want you to think for a moment when you leave here tonight about, you may ask. In 2010, the profits, quarterly profits of Whole Foods went up 58%. In that same period, the food stamps applications in the United States surged 58%. So there's lots of people eating better, more nutritious, more healthy food, and there's a lot of people at the same rate needing food assistance and help. Now, we have incredible solutions. We have, for example, one of the leading food banks in the country including a whole program called food security. We are really looking for solutions here. But the poor are also looking for solutions, and ironically, one of those solutions sometimes come in the form of penetrating and learning how to navigate the big food industrial system. One example here locally that may surprise you is the case of Food City, owned by a family of immigrants, the Bashas. The Bashas came to the United States in 1884, New York, and made their way to Arizona in 1910. The Bashas owned several stores from AJ's to Food City. They are the only locally owned food chain in Arizona. They have 132 outlets, employ more than 8,000 people, and they do something really interesting that has attracted the attention of the entire food sector, which is they do multi-banner marketing. They are the ones who have opened grocery stores in places where no one else would go and open a grocery store. They have a store in Navajo Nation, for example. They have a store in the Tohono O'odham Nation, and they have done that, of course, with the intention of being a profitable company, but at the same time providing a gap in those places, filling the gap where it was most needed. And the thing about Food City is that it combines in really interesting way cultural relevance in their food offerings with affordable prices. I think Gary Nabhan did a study casually a few years ago where he actually went and counted the options of fresh vegetables and found that there were more varieties at Food City at better prices than you would have at Safeway or Albertsons. This has become a really important option for poor people who want to eat. Yes, don't take me wrong, there's still your very good fill of sugar-laden drinks and other things all over the store, but there's a lot of other possibilities inside the store that people make for themselves as the space becomes available for them to craft a culinary identity that could feel some level of empowerment. The cultural relevance I mentioned is really interesting. I don't know about you, but me personally, I love to get my religious artifacts at the same time that I get my dairy. The other called culinary capital, really using a sociological model to begin to understand what is the impact on society of this mobilization of discourse around food distinctions. Refrigerator. If you live in poverty, sometimes your household, you share it with many different people, all of who earn money to contribute to the household. And your refrigerator is not only yours. Some people don't have enough furniture in their homes. Do you know that? Some people don't have enough chairs to have everybody sit at the dinner table. Somebody eats at the couch, and somebody eats in the bedroom, and somebody eats outside in the porch. These are things that we take for granted, forgetting how much of our food preferences are really completely affected by the material conditions that we have to experience that. Not to mention something like literacy, not only to be on top of all the nutritional information and be on top of all of the new trends, but also to read things like menus. That if you're not literate or literate enough to be able to navigate those worlds, feels very intimidating. We forget that even for those of us who have kitchens and live in comfortable homes, home cooking represents that blend between capital and labor at the most fundamental level. Well, if Food City has given the poor and the immigrants in Tucson some options, so has Tucson Meet Yourself. The other thing many people don't realize is that Tucson Meet Yourself is for all the cultural associations that participate. A few years ago, we did a survey and found out that the profits combined from all the food sales accounted to about $250,000. That's on average a profit of about $4,000 per booth over the 3-day weekend. Some make more than that, and some perhaps make less. Imagine if we lined up all those 50 food vendors, cultural associations, and put them in front of the Community Foundation of Southern Arizona and asked the foundation to fund microloans and opportunities for each one of them to get a grant, to invest in their cultural dance group or to send their kids to scholarships, or that money is not available. To submit yourself. They actually generate this themselves to support the operations of the Chinese Cultural Center or of the Buddhist community that comes from Thailand and so forth and so on. Essentially, to submit yourself is this place where we are bracketing the reality of everyday life and allowing an opportunity to participate in that American experience. But at the same time, if to submit yourself is in some ways feeding these ideals of democracy, it's also very good that we consider the role that seduction in general plays in affecting our food choices. I'll go back and tell you about me. This is a Cuban sandwich. This is one of the most delicious things that you could ever taste. It has really tasty things like ham and sweet. And I came to the United States for the first time. We went to LA to visit my uncle, and the food that really stuck in my mind most was this. Talk about seduction. As a 7-year-old, I was fascinated by that little rooster and the colors and the box, and of course, that crunchy flake inside that I wanted to taste. I became an American like that. Assimilation worked with me really, really fast. Of course, back in Cuba, things were a little bit different for my parents. After New York, they went back to Cuba. And bucking the trend, when most Cubans were leaving the island because they were getting their properties confiscated by the new government or they were in disagreement with Castro, my father actually made the decision to go back to Cuba because he was thrilled about the possibility of the revolution. To use a food metaphor, my parents were like salmon swimming upstream. It was because of that that I was born in 1961 in Cuba. But I tell you, I was destined to be a New Yorker. And if I had been, the accent I'll be speaking to you today would be a little bit different. In the early years of the revolution, things really were looking pretty good. This is my 3rd birthday. And my parents were really living a pretty decent life in the new revolutionary Cuba, pretty happy that they went back. As a matter of fact, Cubans had had a long, flirtatious affair with the United States and modernity in many, many ways. So an infrastructure had already been built in Cuba, and some theorists even speculate that it was that middle-class modernity of the American type that in some ways facilitating the revolution. You have to students. Let's go back to the photo for a minute and decode a little bit some of the signs in it. First of all, you see a refrigerator, a sign of middle class. It's a Westinghouse, by the way. There's a china cabinet behind me with some choice dishes that you don't want to use for everyday use. There's a really beautiful tablecloth. Look at the little girl and how she's dressed. She has a brand new dress and a ribbon in her hair. And of course, there's a cake that has been ordered for the occasion. But the most obvious of all, a photographer has been hired to take the photo of the beautiful girl. These are all the quintessential signs of modernity. They were living in Cuba a working class life and coming together with that sort of vision of what it meant to be seduced by this accoutrement of a modern life in a home. people who criticize the food system often talk about how there's such an incredible disconnect between food production and food consumption, that this really food forgetfulness hurts us. And this is why there are incredible, really good programs that try to connect from farm to fork, to try to see and show people the connection of their food production. But we may forget something, that the American dream for the immigrants is precisely the forgetfulness of how difficult it is to get food and how easy it is to get it in the United States. For a lot of people, the drudgery of food preparation and food procurement is something that they want to escape from. And the United States has offered that promise. Now, let me tell you that my father started to change. After the middle period, things started to change in Cuba a little bit. And he was not as happy anymore of being there. In 1969, we left Cuba. Luckily for him, it was not very difficult to leave, in the sense that while he was in the U.S. Army, my sister was born in New York, so we were actually repatriated to the United States through my sister as an American citizen. Over the years, I have come to believe that the curse of exile is an insatiable appetite. My father was obsessed with food. The first 7 years of my life, I recall all kinds of stories on a daily basis about getting food and securing food. The black market was very strong, and if you had connections and you were savvy, you were able to get better food. My father also started reacting to the strong militarization that happened in Cuban society. The Soviets were everywhere. This was not exactly what he had signed up when he thought that he was embracing a socialist revolution. It was very militarized. His speech was really constrained. You had to be a member of the party to actually get some of the benefits that were being promised. Now, I know that there probably are people in the audience who are great admirers of Cuba, of the revolution, and even of some of the major agricultural things that they have done. After all, I'm talking about 1969, and 50 years have passed of this experiment in the Caribbean. But I will tell you that for a long time, this is the supermarket that many Cubans knew. And you can see the emotional force of the contrast for an immigrant and for a man who had, peeled all those potatoes, remember, at the mess hall, in this kind of experience of food. Cuba was also deteriorating in the basic infrastructure, and my father really had a problem with some of these things, so he decided to leave Cuba. But before we left, he was actually very savvy at negotiating, living in there and providing for us. I have a great memory. One of my best memories of my father is that he used to ride a bike and come home every day after work, and I used to run to the door to greet him. And because I knew that he would always be trying to find something in the black market, he often brought really tasty things. He would bring a snack, or he would bring candy and cookies sometimes, things that you couldn't get anywhere else. So I made it a habit to run to the door and ask him, Papi, what did you bring me? And he made it a point to start answering me in a funny way, I brought you your father. Is that not enough? I love that memory of my dad. One time, we had an opportunity to actually get back to the system in a really funny way. There was a special holiday or celebration, I don't remember which, and we went to a restaurant. All the restaurants were owned by the government, of course, by the state. When we went to the restaurant, my dad was mistaken by a high-ranking official of the Communist Party and of the military. So we were ushered inside and given a precious table and brought all kinds of incredible foods and a great service. I'm sure that my mother must have been on pins and needles thinking, what would happen if we are discovered? My father was relishing the whole experience. Not only did it serve him to prove his point that an elite military communist vanguard was privileging itself from the benefits of Cuban labor, but he got to enjoy a lot of really good food. The ideas we carry in our heads, how we imagine our desires to be associated with food, are more enduring sometimes than we realize. We talk about choice and preferences and what the poor should eat or not eat, but researchers have started to now talk about contextual causes of things like obesity, for example. One of the best examples comes from Micronesia. Micronesia is the place in the world that has the highest cost rate of obesity. 88% of Micronesians are obese. And would you believe that most of the research money that has been made available to study this phenomenon actually looks at genetic causes? You know why that is absurd? Because Micronesians didn't used to be obese. In fact, in 1940, the United States Navy conducted a study in Micronesia and found, this is astounding, zero obesity, zero hypertension, and zero diabetes. How could that be that since 1940 to now, 88% of Micronesians are obese? What happened to Micronesians was an incredibly sustained pattern of colonial intervention that has changed the basic notions of their economy. For example, Micronesians were used to eating naturally low-fat and low-carb diets. Why? Because they ate fish, and the tubers that they ate were very high fiber. But all of a sudden, we established companies. Two major companies dominate the production of tuna in the entire world. So they go to Micronesians, and the Micronesians sell their rights to fishing in exchange for cash. So many of them, for this cash, they no longer are interested in cultivating their own plots and have given up on agriculture. The other thing that has happened is that by tuna being exported and being very priced as a commodity to export, today Micronesians eat 1% of the tuna that is fished in their country. 99% of the tuna from Micronesia we eat, and it's eaten in Japan. That's the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened is that as those jobs disappeared, American companies took over and also used Micronesia for military bases. We started importing food aid. So our surplus food and commodities started to get to the Micronesians in the same way that they got to the Tohono O'odham, in the form of flour and sugar and salted snacks. But the most important thing that happened to the Micronesians, according to some of the most progressive researchers, is that the Micronesians wanted to be like us. They want to be modern. They want to eat potato chips, and they want to eat at McDonald's. They want all those things that equate in a symbolic way eating those foods with being modern and advanced and progressive and being a developed kind of people. In other words, we say, we can really be happy that we gifted ourselves to the Micronesians in this way. We talk about an obesity epidemic, but what about the endemic conditions of capitalism in a global scale? Professor Lauren Berland at Chicago University has written about obesity and has introduced the concept of slow death that is actually endemic to so many of the practices that we sustain. And the real challenge is, how do we change the economic system to be able to provide more food security and food equality? And her definition of a slow death will blow you away the way that it blew me away. Her definition is that a slow death is the condition of being worn out by the activity of reproducing life. Talk about ordinary definitions of life and talk about the impact that it has. But of course, myself have hope and see the aspiration of community every time. And I see it everywhere. I see it in Tucson. Meet yourself when girls come together in mariachi to sing and to do something for their community. It's the same kind of hope, if you think about it, that motivated those students to sit at that counter until it took whatever it took until they can make social change in this country, right? It's the same kind of hope that encouraged and nourished the civil rights movement to break bread at church potlucks that brought blacks and whites together to completely redefine the American foodscape and social landscape. It's also the kind of hope that you can feel in the smile of a Buddhist monk preparing fresh dumplings for you at Tucson. Meet yourself. Every time we make the festival happen, we get so tired. It's so hard to control so many things that happen right and things that happen wrong. But then we are reminded of how we touch something deep and wonderful in the humanity that we share as Tucsonans. People who ordinarily have nothing to do with each other are over there mixing and eating each other's foods in some sort of like crazy experiment of cultural democracy. Now, we are now starting to think that 41 years of celebrating food has been a good thing, so maybe we ought to now start talking about some other things, like making an impact in the economic landscape of our city. And that's why we come together with SBS to form the new Southwest Folk Life Alliance, the parent company that now will produce to submit yourself, but do so many other things. And among them, we are contemplating how we move from celebration to economic empowerment in many of the participants of the festival. For example, we are interested in launching some micro enterprises and micro loans to help some of those food vendors actually develop avenues of becoming more integrated as immigrant and as ethnic practitioners of heritage foods into the mainstream economy of Tucson. We're interested in the informal economy and that lady who sells tamales in the parking lot, that she may be able to have a food handler's license so that the next time you stop by and want to buy her tamales, you may not hesitate because she actually has a label that says, hey, by the way, these are actually produced in a safe manner. We're interested in exploring how we can have a Heritage Foodway Institute so we can advance in partnership with the Food Bank and so many others, Iskashira, and so many other wonderful organizations pushing an agenda of social equity in food and getting to that conversation beyond the festival. Gary Nabhan mentioned here last week the efforts of some people doing slow food as a movement to create alternative economies, to people invest their own money. Well, right now at the Southwest Folk Life Alliance, we are trying to come up with 100 investors that will help us gather the first slow food fund here in Tucson to invest in this way. 100 investors at $500 a piece, buying shares and together getting the first $50,000 to make this possible. And by the way, 10% of the audience here today would represent those 100 investors. If you're interested in these initiatives of food democracy, please talk to me. Find me on the internet, talk to me, and reach out and tell me how you want to partner to make a difference in all of these stories. I want to close with a personal story. My mother, before she died, especially those last few years, pleaded with me intensely to watch my weight. It was something so emotional for her. I could never completely understand it. She would actually say, please, 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 don't gain weight. Control what you eat. Exercise. She was very worried about my health, but she was also worried that I will face social and professional obstacles if I didn't watch my weight in that way. It was such an emotional issue I could never understand, and I will tell you, I don't have the time tonight, nor is this the appropriate setting for me to explore here what that relationship was and that exchange with my mother and to analyze my bad food habits. But I can tell you that the story of food in our family didn't end well. My father died of complications with diabetes. He was on dialysis, and he had lost his sight. And it was such a bitter end for someone who had lived and loved life with such passion. My brother and sister, we do what all the children of immigrant parents do. We try to honor the dignity of my parents' working class experience at the same time that we are trying to rewrite the script of our own lives in this country. Now, I'm full of hope. Don't take me wrong. These are my daughters, and I am full of hope every time that I see them. And I believe that the pernicious ambiguity that food has had in our Cuban family can be reversed in their lifetime. I also believe in the potential and the promise of community building, not in a romantic way, but rooted in authentic exchanges of human experience. promised land of democracy. I'm interested in the potential that we have together to create familia, into so meet yourself when people who don't know each other dance together on the streets. That keeps me going. Let me ask you, what will your next food encounter teach you? Where will you go to break bread? Which tasty ritual of culinary transgression will redefine who you are? Thank you very much.
Marvelous state.
Thank you. Thank you.
What a wonderful mix of the personal and the public and also the political. I want to let everyone know that Maribel will be responding to questions and the Arizona Daily Star website on Friday at noon for an hour, and you can just type in your question and she will write back to you. And please join us next week when we will learn about how the Romans ate, an archaeological perspective from Dr. Emma Blake of the School of Anthropology. Thank you all and good night.